Good morning, everyone. How are you today? Are you enjoying Tech Days 2011? All right, wonderful. My name is Dan Holm. I hail from Maui, Hawaii. I arrived yesterday, and I sent some of the good weather ahead of me. I see you've had great weather here in Antwerp. And it's my pleasure to be back here in Antwerp and to spend the next day with you diving into key technologies within SharePoint and Windows Active Directory. My information is up here on the slide, and on the slide there is a link to a site where I will post the slides for download, but you don't have to worry about writing that down because it will also be available on the TechNet site as well. So a little bit about myself. My name is Dan Holm. I'm an MVP in SharePoint Server, and I'm the Chief SharePoint Evangelist for a company called AvePoint, which is one of the major software vendors in the SharePoint space. But I've spent 17 years as a consultant and trainer, serving mostly very large organizations, including NBC Television, which is one of the 3 or 4 large television networks in the USA. And for NBC, I'm the technologies consultant during the broadcast of the Olympic Games. And so I was lucky enough to spend time in Torino, Beijing, and Vancouver, and we're just getting ready to stage the technologies for London as well. And I hope during today I'll be able to share with you some of the experience I've gained through those customers that I've served as a consultant as well. I also am an author. I wrote both the SharePoint 2010 Training Kit and the SharePoint 2010 Microsoft Official Curriculum Course for administrators, and I am an author for SharePoint Pro magazine. And if you are not yet a subscriber to our weekly newsletter, I do recommend that you go to SharePointProMag.com and sign up for the newsletter. It comes out once a week, and myself and my colleagues write information that is really targeted to business, IT pro, and developers in the SharePoint space. It's a great resource, and I encourage you to use that. My Twitter handle is @DanHolm. My email address is here as well. And do not hesitate to email me after today if you've got questions or if you need help succeeding with SharePoint. My job is to help the community elevate its use of SharePoint. So I look forward to hearing from you after today. And during the day, as we go through this session, I also am here to answer your questions as well. So if something isn't clear, if you want more details, or if I simply get talking too fast in my crazy Hawaiian American English, feel free to slow me down and shout out. But please realize I have spotlights in my eyes, and so I can't necessarily see your hands. And so in addition to raising your hands, you might shout out, "Hey, Dan," or something like that, and I'll be happy to answer your questions. So the goal of this session is to provide as much information as possible in an hour and 15 minutes about the topics within SharePoint that tend to cause the most confusion, that tend to lead IT professionals down the wrong path into a place that isn't perhaps as manageable as it should be or secure as it should be. And so this is a session in which we will tackle several topics that I find to be particularly problematic within SharePoint. So hopefully, by the end of this session, you'll have picked up some great best practices and guidance. And then later on today, I'm doing a session called Managing the SharePoint Disruption. And during that session, we'll look at things you can do as an organization, as an enterprise, as well as IT professionals to ensure success with SharePoint, to ensure you have a scalable, successful enterprise. So this is really a set of specific technical points. And then this afternoon, we'll look at creating a business and enterprise blueprint for your SharePoint implementation. So with that said, the first topic we're going to tackle are the accounts that are necessary to install SharePoint in an enterprise. SharePoint is a service. You need service accounts, and there are several accounts that are necessary, and we'll take a look at each of them. Now, as I go through these accounts, there are a lot of hidden slides in the slide deck. So everything that I say is in the slides. You may not see it on screen, but it is there. So when you download the slides, you'll have all the information you need. The first account we need to look at is the SharePoint Administrator and Setup User account. Now, this is an account that Microsoft calls the SharePoint Setup User, but I like to think of it as something a little bigger than that. This is the SharePoint Farm Administrator and Setup User account, and this is an account that you will use as a human being to install SharePoint and to perform major administrative tasks. So this is simply a user account in the domain that is in the administrators group of each server in your SharePoint farm, because you will be logging on as this account to install SharePoint software, language packs, service packs, and cumulative updates. So it must be an administrator on those machines. In addition, this account needs two permissions in SQL called DB Creator and Security Admin. So for those of you who are less familiar with SQL, let's take a quick look at how you assign these permissions to this account. So we have a virtual environment, and in our domain, we have an organizational unit called Service Accounts. And in this OU, we have our service account identities, including the SharePoint Administrator and Setup User account. And the name doesn't matter at all. I like to use a naming convention, SP for SharePoint _admin, but the name doesn't matter. We need to put that account in the local administrators group of each server in the farm, which you certainly know how to do. And we also need to assign it permissions within SQL. So in SQL Server Management Studio, the SQL administrator can assign the correct permissions. So opening up SQL Management Studio, in the logons node, we can create a new login. And when we create a login in SQL Server, this is not creating an account. It is simply saying that this existing domain account, Contoso SP admin, has the right to log on to this SQL Server, and then we can specify the permissions that that account has, and we need to assign DB Creator and Security Admin. Now, with these two permissions, you will be able to install SharePoint. During SharePoint setup, you are logged on as this account, and you create the farm configuration database. So you must have the DB Creator permission. And then you assign permissions to that database to the SharePoint Farm Service account, so you need the permission to change permissions, which is called Security Admin. So you're able to create databases and then assign permissions to those databases with these two SQL roles. So those are the two permissions you need. If you're going to use SharePoint, if you're going to use PowerShell to configure your farm, you have to also assign the SharePoint Shell Access role. And the real important point about this account is that this is not your administrative account. Please don't log on as yourself and install SharePoint. The reason is the account that's used to install SharePoint gets tattooed into the environment in a lot of places. It becomes the DBO of the farm configuration database, and it goes into various registry and file settings as the owner. And so if you move on to another job, or if you leave the company altogether, the company can't necessarily disable your account and transfer those roles to another administrator until they go in and unravel it from all the places within SharePoint where that account has been tattooed. So therefore, you should have a generic account, such as SP_admin, that you use to install SharePoint. Now, after you've installed SharePoint, you will add your Windows account to the Farm Administrators group, and from that point forward, you will use your account to administer SharePoint on a day-to-day basis. But this account will be used if you perform major farm tasks, like adding a server to the farm, removing a server from the farm, adding language packs, hotfixes, service packs, and cumulative updates. So when you perform major tasks that affect the bits on the server, you use this account. When you are performing day-to-day administration, you use your Windows account. So please try to use a generic account that then gives your enterprise an account that represents the SharePoint service. The second account you need is the SharePoint service account itself. This is an easy one. You can call it something like SP_farm, and this account becomes the service, the primary service account for SharePoint that runs the application pool for central administration. It's used as the account for the timer service and for other really important SharePoint services. So this is a service account in the more traditional state, and all of the permissions this account needs are given to it automatically during setup. So you don't need to assign this account any permissions, and you shouldn't have to troubleshoot this account unless someone in your environment goes and starts removing permissions from it. Then, of course, some things might break. The one time that you need to do something to this account is when you provision the user profile synchronization service. When you provision the user profile synchronization service, you add this account into the administrators group of the server running that service, and that is documented in the process for provisioning the user profile synchronization service. But otherwise, you don't need to install this, you don't need to assign this account any permissions. You also will need a service account for SQL, a standard Windows service account for the SQL service, and you will need at least 2 accounts for application pools. One for user-facing web applications in SharePoint, and one for services like Search, Excel, and so forth. The service account will be much more privileged than the account for user-facing web apps, so it's important that you have at least those two. And we'll talk later on about how many additional accounts you might use for additional application pools, but at least two. Finally, you will need a crawl account for a SharePoint search to crawl content, and you will need an account for the user profile synchronization service itself, which you might call something like SP_user_sync. So if we look back at our domain controller, we see these accounts that we've just talked about: SP_admin, SP_farm, SP_web_apps and SP_service_apps, and then SP_crawl for the search crawler, and SP_user_sync. Now, this particular account I'd like to spend one more moment talking about. This account is used if you are using the synchronization service to connect to Active Directory and take profile properties into the user profile database in SharePoint. You can also connect to other data sources like PeopleSoft or some back-end data source as well. So this is the account that's used. And in order to connect to Active Directory, this account must be delegated a permission at the domain level. So this account requires a permission on the domain. Let me show you what that is. If we delegate control at the domain to that account, the permission we must assign is called replicating directory changes, right here. So this is an account that this is the permission this account needs to grab the attributes from Active Directory and populate the profile store in SharePoint. Now, if you are in an organization where you manage SharePoint and someone else manages Active Directory, if you go to that person and tell her that you want to delegate something at the domain, she's going to laugh at you and say, "No way." Because Active Directory people get very nervous when you start delegating with an Active Directory, particularly at the domain level. So it's important that you're able to understand what this permission really does so that you can communicate to your Active Directory team and help them understand. What this permission does is it gives the account the ability to look at changes that are being made in Active Directory when, say, someone changes their job title or their office address. And the user profile synchronization service can see that change and populate it into the profile database. Now, keep in mind that every user in Active Directory already has pretty much full read permission. Any user can read another user's job title and office address. So this isn't granting additional permissions, really. What it's doing is making it more efficient. Because if the user profile service had to read everything in Active Directory every hour and figure out what had changed, that would put a tremendous burden on your domain controllers. It would be very inefficient. So instead of reading everything in Active Directory, the account simply looks at the feed of information that's being changed. It just is a much more efficient form of a read permission. So if you can explain that to your Active Directory team, they'll understand, hopefully, and if not, have them email me and I'll explain it to them. Because this is not a big deal. You need to help your Active Directory teams understand this is not, it sounds important, but it really isn't. So those are the accounts that you have to configure. Again, in the slide deck, there are hidden slides for each of these accounts. But I'd like to see if there are any questions about these accounts. So does anyone have any questions at this point? Yes. Perfect question. The question is, what about password changes on these accounts? How many of us like to change service account passwords? Are you paid by the hour? No, of course, password changes are very, very painful, and so that's a perfect question. And in fact, in just a moment, we're going to talk about how to manage those. So just hold on one moment. That's actually one of the topics we'll cover. Other questions? Yes. As opposed to? Oh, good question. The SQL Server, okay, so his question is about the SQL Service account. The SQL Service account is just a standard SQL account. It has nothing really to do with SharePoint. It's just required because SharePoint requires SQL. Yes, if you already have SQL running, you do not need to create a new account for that. That's correct. Other questions? Okay. So let's go on a little bit further, and then we'll come back to this issue of password changes. You have these accounts for your farm for your, let's say, your production farm. What if you have another farm in your environment? What if you have a test farm, a QA farm? If you've got a farm in another location? For each farm, you should have a separate set of these accounts. And so your naming convention needs to help you identify which farm service account is for production, for test, and for development. And the reason you want those multiple accounts is, first of all, to ensure least privilege, so that if a developer has the password for the farm account in the development farm, that developer doesn't necessarily have control of the production farm. Also for auditing, if you're looking at your domain logs and you're seeing something strange happening, it's good to know which farm is creating those problems. And finally, when we talk about password changes in a moment, we're going to see that SharePoint farms can automatically change the passwords for you. So if your production farm changes the passwords on its account, your development farm will no longer know that password. So it has to have a separate set of accounts. So if you have multiple farms, you do need multiple accounts. Now, the last set of accounts you're going to need relate to the application pools that you're going to use. And we already talked about the idea that you will have at least two. You'll have an application pool for user-facing web applications and an application pool for service applications. Let's go and take a little bit more detailed look at that idea. So if we're going to jump over to our SharePoint server. And on our SharePoint server, we'll open up IIS. And when you create a web application in SharePoint, you are creating an IIS site as well. And that IIS site runs in the context of an application pool. So an application pool, for those of you who are less familiar with IIS, an application pool is very similar to a service. It is a process that runs with an identity, and within that process is the code that allows IIS to receive a request and render content. So this is very much like a service. It runs with an identity, and let's look at the identity column over here. So we can see we have identities for each of these application pools. And again, we mentioned that you will have at least one for your user-facing web apps and one for your service applications. When you have a process in its own application pool, when you have a web application in its own application pool, that process is isolated from other application pools. So if something goes wrong with a web application, you can reset that application pool, and it will not affect all of the other applications that are running in other application pools. Plus, there's a security boundary where the identity for this application pool, if it gets compromised, that identity won't have access to resources that are used by this web application that is running as a different identity. So from a management perspective, it's nice to have every web application in its own application pool. That would be a good thing. The problem is that application pools are a limited resource. They consume system resources, particularly RAM, and so you cannot have an infinite number of application pools on a server. The number you can have really depends on the server and its performance, but guidance is that you should have no more than 10 application pools on a single IIS server. And this machine that we're looking at here is pretty much an out-of-box SharePoint server. I didn't do a lot of customization to it. And you can see we have almost 10 application pools in this server already. And so we can't necessarily add each new application in its own application pool. So the guidance then is, as far as what you do with application pools, and this is what we've just been talking about here, is that you put all service applications on a server in a shared application pool, and you put all user-facing web applications in a shared application pool. So those are the two application pools we talked about. And then if you have a really significant security reason for adding an additional application pool, you can. But try to put applications in a shared application pool from a performance and resource perspective. Now, that said, with SharePoint, you can have multiple servers in your farm. So you could have a server running search, a server running Excel, a server running PowerPoint services, a server running performance point services, and each of those servers can be running their service in an application pool that's unique to that server. So you could, in fact, have all your services in separate application pools if they're running on separate servers. But the guidance is on a single server, you put them in a shared application pool. Now, an example of where you might have a security reason for having additional application pools is for external-facing web applications. Obviously, you want to isolate those from a security perspective, and so your extranet, your public-facing website, probably should be in a different application pool than your intranet site, and we will create this in just a moment, in fact. These are the recommendations that we've been talking about, just summarized on the slide for you, so you have them as a checklist for you. Any questions on application pools? And then the next topic we will get to is that automatic password management. Any questions? All right. The perfect question was asked earlier, which is, what do we do with these service accounts? We're going to have a lot of service accounts, and we all know that it's painful to change passwords. So when you change a password in Active Directory, you then have to go register that change on each service itself as well, and that's very, very painful. And so that a lot of organizations ended up in the past setting service passwords to never expire, which of course is a very bad practice. So what Microsoft did with SharePoint 2010 is they introduced a solution called Managed Accounts. Now the Managed Accounts feature is part of SharePoint. There is also a feature of Active Directory in Windows Server 2008 R2 called Managed Service Accounts. And the Managed Service Accounts feature in R2 Active Directory is not to be used with SharePoint. It has no role in the SharePoint farm. What you can use are SharePoint Managed Accounts. So let's take a look at this feature, and we're going to step through how to register it, how to use it, and how to change passwords. So we'll do this live here. So let's set up a scenario in which we want to create a web application for our public-facing website. And our public-facing website, we want to put in its own application pool for security reasons, and so we will create a separate identity for that application pool. So we're going to start by creating an account in Active Directory, SharePoint, public-facing website. If I can type here. I put on my glasses. I'm farsighted, so it helps me to see. And we'll call it spwww. All right, so we create the account in Active Directory, nothing special there, it's just an account. But what becomes special is we register it with SharePoint. So in Central Administration, we can go to Security and into Configure Managed Accounts. This is the page we will be spending some time in for a few moments here. And in this page, we see our existing managed accounts, and we register that account that we just created. Registering it tells SharePoint that the account exists in Active Directory, and it then allows SharePoint to manage the account in Active Directory. So we tell SharePoint that we just created this account called Contoso spwww, and we tell SharePoint the current password. Now that's important. SharePoint is going to know the password currently. Click OK. And then we can use this account in SharePoint when we create services and web applications. So the next step then would be to create the public-facing website. So we'll create a www site. And the key part here is we're going to create a new application pool for the public website, and we pick the identity that we want that application pool to run as. Now this is a very important point here. Notice we don't specify the password. We pick the account. SharePoint already knows that account's password. We're just associating that account with this new web application. So we pick the account from a drop-down list. We finish this process, and it takes some time, so I'm going to skip that for now. And now that we've created that, now that we have that account, when it comes time to change the password, in Central Administration, we go to edit that account, we change the password, and we put in a new password. When I click OK, SharePoint will now change the password in Active Directory, then it will change the password on the application pool itself. It will reset the application pool, and we're done. We don't have to change it in two places, we change it in one, which is in SharePoint itself. Now, the obvious question is, what delegation does SharePoint need to do this? And the answer is nothing. Your Active Directory team will love this because you don't have to delegate anything for this feature. Because what SharePoint is using is a permission called change password. Now, what we are used to as IT pros, we are used to the reset password permission. With reset password, you have to be delegated that permission, and then you as an IT pro can change a user's password, and you don't have to know their current password. The other option is the change password permission, in which you put in the current password and the new password, and that's a different permission. And in Active Directory, every user already has that permission. So if I know your password currently, I can change your password. Anyone who knows the current password can change the password. So SharePoint is using an existing delegation that applies to all domain users. You don't have to delegate anything for this to work. SharePoint just changes the password, resets, changes it on the application pool, resets the application pool, and life is good. And if you want to get even more secure, you can generate a new password, in which case SharePoint will evaluate the password policy for length and complexity, and will create a password that's random. You won't even know the password, and your security team will love that. Because privileged services are accounts that administrators shouldn't know the password for. If you're troubleshooting and you have to know the password, you can put it in. But on a day-to-day basis, you really shouldn't know the password of a privileged account like the SharePoint farm or an application pool. So this is how you change passwords manually using managed accounts. And in Active Directory, you can actually then delegate the organizational unit so that no administrator can go to Active Directory and change it there. You don't need to use administrators to change it in Active Directory anymore. But if an administrator does change it in Active Directory, that's what the third box is for. An administrator changes it directly in Active Directory, SharePoint doesn't know that new password, and the services will fail. They won't be able to log on. So you can come into Managed Accounts, tell SharePoint what the new password is in Active Directory, and SharePoint simply updates the accounts in SharePoint. So that is the manual process. Now you'll notice down here, we're going to next talk about how to automatically change passwords. But any questions on the manual process at this point? All right. So the automatic password changes are even more cool. So let's scroll down and take a look at these. We can enable automatic password changes, and let me go ahead and populate some information, and then we will zoom in. Now, the way you read this part of the page is from the bottom up. The first thing you want to think about is what is the schedule on which passwords will be changed. You can change passwords monthly or weekly, and you can specify the date and the time in which passwords will be changed. So this is the first thing you configure. Now, when the password is changed, the services and application pools will have to be reset, and so there will be a small time in which there is no service. And that will roll through the servers on your farm as well. So there's the possibility that that there will be some lack of service, which happens no matter what when you change a password. So what you can do, secondly, is you can specify that you want to notify administrators so that administrators know that the password is going to change on Sunday night. Now, 5 days in advance is a long time. If I get an email about something that's happening in 5 days, I'll forget. Probably better to send it out 1 or 2 days in advance. But this is simply telling administrators the password is going to be changed. They can make sure that the time window is correct, and that's what that's for. The third option on this page is the fail-safe. What this option does is it says that if I'm going to wait until May 7th to change the password, but the password is going to expire on April 30th. It's going to expire before the scheduled date. Then 2 days before that, I'll change the password in SharePoint. So SharePoint is actually able to look at the date the password will expire, and it can anticipate that in case the password expires before it would be changed by SharePoint automatically. So this is the order in which you think about these three options on this particular part. And when the password is changed, it is random. It is compliant with your domain password policy for that account. And your security team will love this because, again, you won't know the passwords. And you will love this because you now don't have to change these passwords in SharePoint ever again. Wouldn't it be nice if every service had this kind of thing? This is pretty darn cool. Questions so far? All right. And notice at the bottom, it tells us when the next password is going to be, or password change will be. So when I click OK and save these changes, it's going to update that and tell us. I think I might have put in a new password, huh? I might have made a mistake in my demo. We'll see if it gives us an error. That's taking a little longer than normal. I think I might have put in some bad information. We'll check that out in a moment. So all of the things I've just shown you are in the slide deck again. So we've talked about manual and automatic password changes. Now there's one very big caveat. There's one problem with this whole story, and that is not every account in SharePoint is a managed account. All of your services and application pools are, but there are a couple of accounts that are not managed, and they include the crawler, the user profile synchronization account, and any accounts in the secure store. And what you need to know as an IT pro is you need to be able to recognize what is a managed account and what is an unmanaged account. When you see a managed account, you pick it from a list of accounts that you've already registered. When you see a prompt that asks you for a username and a password, that is an unmanaged account. And let's take a look at an example here. Yeah, this is simply because I put in the same password and it couldn't change it. Sorry about that. So if we go into our service applications and go into search as an example, I mentioned earlier about the default crawl account, and the default crawl account is used to index content. When you configure the crawl account, notice that you're not asked to pick an existing account. You're asked to specify an account and a password. That means that this is an unmanaged account. So when you configure this account, you put in the username and password. When it comes time to change that account's password, you have to do it the old way. You have to go to Active Directory and change it, and then come into SharePoint and change it. Same thing with the user profile synchronization service and all of the accounts in the secure store. So unfortunately, there's some places where you still have to do it the old way. And you should make sure that you never put a managed account username into an unmanaged position. So for example, if you have an account like sp_farm, it should never go in the search account, because then when it changes, when SharePoint changes the password of that account, the crawler won't know that new password. And unfortunately, this actually happens when you configure search. When you deploy search the very first time, you put search in an application pool with an identity like sp_service apps. And that same identity, which is a managed account, is used as the default crawler. And so SharePoint makes a bad configuration choice by default. And 1 month later, when SharePoint changes the password on the service applications account, the service can be updated, but the crawler isn't, and crawling stops. And you start getting logon errors for the crawler. So you do need to be careful that you have separate accounts anywhere that is unmanaged versus the accounts that are managed. And some additional resources for you are online, but that is the story with managed accounts. So hopefully that answered your question. Did that answer that? All right. And there was an additional question. Yeah. Good question. Are there any plans to streamline this with SharePoint, the next version of SharePoint? I actually don't know yet. It's a little early to say. What I do with my customers is I create a scheduled task in PowerShell that runs every month and changes these accounts. It changes the password in Active Directory. It registers the new password in SharePoint. And so I'm just running a scheduled task to do the same thing, but it's too early to say whether this will be changed in SharePoint 2011. And part of the reason is, particularly with the secure store accounts, for those of you who are not familiar with the secure store is a pool of accounts that can be used to go to back-end data sources. So you might have an Excel worksheet that you're rendering with Excel services that goes to a back-end database. It can pick an account out of the secure store and go to the back-end database. The back-end database may not be a Windows machine at all. It may be a system that can't be incorporated with a password change. And so some of these accounts, the reason that they're not managed is because of the nature of the account itself. Even crawling. SharePoint might change the account in Active Directory, but if you're crawling a workgroup server, that workgroup server won't know the new password either. So some of it is actually by design. Other questions? Okay. Let's jump back here. So the next topic that we're going to cover that I see a lot of confusion about in the marketplace and then in the community is storage optimization. And how do you improve the storage story with SharePoint? And this is going to focus primarily on a technology called Remote Blob Store. So those of you who are familiar with that, that's what we're going to talk about for a few moments here. When you store a file in SharePoint, that file is stored in SQL as what's called a blob, a binary large object. And by default, SharePoint does store all of its content in SQL. So if you have a document library with lots of documents in it, your SQL database will get quite large. Remote blob store, and by the way, the problem with that is, first of all, it's expensive from a storage cost perspective. Most of us use tier 1 storage for our SQL servers. It's expensive, it's fast, it has lots of features. And so storing files in that is just plain expensive from a money perspective. Perhaps more importantly, it's very expensive from a performance perspective. And this is something that is under-documented. It's something that most people don't focus on, but I think is a bigger problem. SQL Server is a database server. It is designed to optimize performance for data access of structured relational data, just like Oracle, just like a number of other products. And when you start putting blobs into a SQL database, it slows everything down. So if you have a document library with a lot of blobs, and in the same content database, you're looking at a list and you're trying to do a view, which is basically a query, that view will be so much slower than if you didn't have the blobs in that same content database. And this is true, of course, it's not just SharePoint and SQL, it's true of any product storing data in a database like SQL or Oracle. So blobs really, really drag down performance. And if people are saying, my SharePoint is slow, one of the main reasons could be because you're storing blobs in your database. So remote blob storage, or RBS, is a feature that is introduced in SharePoint 2010. There was a similar feature called Extended Blob Store in 2007, but this is now sort of the new version, and it's very, very solid. And RBS is a set of APIs that allow you to store those blobs in a remote store. And that remote store can be the file system of the SQL Server, just like on the C drive or D drive. It can be a SAN, a NAS, a cloud, really anything. So that remote blob store takes those blobs out of the SQL content database. Now, the way this figure is drawn is something you really should focus on, because conceptually, this is exactly what's happening. SharePoint's at the top of a technology stack. And when SharePoint stores a document, it sends it down the stack. And down the stack are these APIs that decide whether that document goes into SQL or into remote blob store. The reason that's important is because everything that SharePoint does doesn't know and doesn't care what's going on with remote blob store. So whether you use remote blob store or not, SharePoint can store documents, SharePoint can do versioning, SharePoint can do check-in and check-out, the documents are indexed, the documents are backed up. So everything is the same whether you use remote blob store or not. You just suddenly reduce storage cost, reduce the size of your content databases, improve potentially backup and restore times, and definitely increase performance. So there's a lot of benefits to remote blob store. And there's a number of people out there who argue that SharePoint really never, ever should have been designed to store documents in a SQL database in the first place. You'll hear people make that argument, and there's some truth to that. So now you've got the ability to work around that design default of SharePoint 2010. Now, the components that are required, you need SQL Server 2008 or 2008 R2, and you need what's called a provider. The provider is basically like the driver, you can think of it, for RBS, that understands how to interact with the remote blob store. So there's an out-of-box driver that you can download from Microsoft for free called the file stream provider, and that allows SQL to store the blobs in the local file system of the server. Now, that means on the C drive, the D drive, whatever. And keep in mind that if the SQL Server is mounted to a SAN, the storage area network appears as a local file volume, so that counts as well. So the file stream provider is out of box, and then there's lots of third parties that provide that create providers as well. AvePoint, StoragePoint, several others are out there that do that. So let's take a look at a little bit more of this, how this works. So you've got your provider that we've already talked about, and the provider communicates with the remote blob store. And one little note here is, if you're storing your blobs in a truly remote location, like on a NAS device or in the cloud, you need to look at the licensing of SQL Server, because SQL Server licensing, the way it's written, is that you need the Enterprise Edition of SQL Server to do truly remote blob store. But you need to look at the licensing. I'm not a licensed expert. That's just a note there. You also have rules. And rules determine which documents go into the remote blob store or not. So the file stream provider has an out-of-box rule for file size that you can set and say anything less than 256K goes into the SQL database, anything greater than 256K goes in the blob store. You can set a rule based on file size. As I mentioned, backup and restore is going to work as long as you're using SharePoint's tools or SharePoint's APIs. So remember this stack. If you're up at the top in SharePoint doing a backup, SharePoint doesn't know or care that you've got remote blob store going on. So if you perform a backup, you're going to get everything from the SQL database and from the remote blob store. And you can even back it up and then restore it into your lab where you don't have remote blob store running, and everything will just go into the SQL database there, and vice versa. So if you're using SharePoint Backup or a tool that uses SharePoint APIs, backup works. And the reason I emphasize this is I hear a lot of people saying, well, backup breaks with remote blob store. That's not true. Backup works with remote blob store. What breaks is if you are backing up your SQL databases directly. So I have a number of customers who have a SQL team, and the SQL team backs up the SQL databases directly, not using SharePoint tools, but using SQL backup tools. If you're doing that, then you need to worry about the remote blob store, because the SQL database basically has links in it that point to the remote blob store, and if you back up the SQL database, you're not getting those blobs. You need to back up the blob store also, and you need to do it in such a way that when you restore it, you're not restoring links to a blob store that doesn't exist or that documents aren't in. So you have to worry about timing and snapshots and those kinds of things if you're backing up SQL directly. But if you're using SharePoint APIs, PowerShell, central administration, any third-party tool that uses SharePoint's APIs, backup does work. You don't have to worry about that. So guidance on remote blob store. What should you use it or not? And just a second, let me finish this up and then I'll answer your questions. To decide whether you should use remote blob store or not, first, look at your blobs. Look at what you're actually storing. How big are the blobs? What types of documents are they? How are they accessed? Is this file accessed all the time, rapidly by users? Or is it put into the document library and people look at it once in a while and modify it once in a while? What is the handling? In other words, if you're storing, let's say, a video, it can be helpful to put the video in another location that can actually stream the video later, as opposed to putting it in the SQL database where when a user clicks it, they have to wait for it to download before it even plays. So you want to look at all of the blobs themselves, and then you want to look at the third-party providers and how they enhance remote blob store. So when you look at a third-party provider, they will add more rules, they'll add storage platforms, they'll improve performance, but they have a cost. So let's talk about these things. Rules. The file stream provider out of box only does file size. When you get to third parties, you've got the ability to say, oh, I want things in this document library to be in remote blob store, but not in this document library. Or I want this content type to be in remote blob store, but not this content type. Or based on metadata, or based on the last time a document was accessed, maybe it goes into the remote blob store. So they've got much more sophisticated rules. They can support other storage platforms, so instead of being restricted to the file system of the SQL Server, you can store on a NAS device, on the cloud, in a file share, whatever that third party lets you do. And most third-party providers will perform better than the file stream provider, but they have a cost. And so you need to balance all those things out. And my last 2 points before I take questions on this is, first, the file stream provider that Microsoft gives us for free is just fine. It works. Again, I hear a lot of people out there saying, oh, the file stream provider is terrible, you should never use it. I don't agree with that at all. It's a tool, and if you follow the steps at the top of the slide, you might find that it works very well for your environment. And in fact, if you're looking at a scenario, as most of us are, where you're taking your file shares and you're just dumping them into SharePoint, the access patterns fit quite well. You're taking large files that aren't accessed very regularly, and you're just dumping them into SharePoint instead of a file share. And the file stream provider will work perfectly well, just like your file share did before. So file stream provider is not as bad as some people make it out to be. Your third-party providers are generally a little bit better, and the one I will point you to, because it's free, is the extender from AvePoint. You can download this tool. It's completely free, no time limit at all. And it allows you to have more sophisticated rules and to store on file shares and on the cloud. So this is one of the few no-brainers in SharePoint is to use the file stream provider or the AvePoint extender as a remote blob store extension. Okay, so there were a couple of questions. Let me see if I can get those. Yeah.
What about DPM 2010 and backup in blob database?
Good question. His question is about using Data Protection Manager 2010 and backing up blobs. It depends on how you've configured DPM, actually. If you're using the SharePoint APIs, again, it will get it. But if you're going and backing up the databases directly, then you need to worry about backing up the blob store at the same time. Yeah, item level recovery will work with DPM as well. Now, beyond that, I'm not a data protection manager expert, so you're just about to hit the end of my expertise in that spot. But yes, that will still work. Any other questions? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Great question. His question is if you have an existing database, and is it easy to add remote blob store later? And the answer is yes. When you configure remote blob store, it takes effect from this point forward, but you can run a series of PowerShell scripts that you can download from TechNet that will go through that content database, apply the rules, and move things into the blob store. Oh, and I actually wanted to show you this. So before I answer more questions, let me show you an example here. If we go to, let's see, demos. So this particular web application is in the content database that is set to use remote blob store. So let me upload a file here. I'm going to, what's my biggest file? Well, that is my biggest file. Let's rename this. New big file. I'm going to upload that into my document library. And by the way, while this is spinning in the background, this is a view into my remote blob store on my SQL server. Whoops, sorry. So on the C drive, there's a full, and you get to name this. I called it blob store, and we can see what's there now. Now let's keep an eye on this as I upload this new file. Hopefully the gods of live demonstration are with me here. Oops, I didn't go deep enough, I don't think, but let's take a look. Let's see, that's March 22nd. There we go. There's the new file, dated today. I'm still in New York time, it looks like. But there's the new file right there. So that is the blob. It has a GUID that is linked to in the content database in SQL. This file is accessible. If you have permission into the blob store and you have the right tools, so example, I know that this is a notepad file, I can actually open it up and look at it. But that's the blob store. And versioning still works, and histories and all that stuff still work. And the one other thing I wanted to mention about this is think about what you can do by having the documents in a separate storage platform and the features you get from that storage platform. So for example, this is on an NTFS file system. I could right-click this folder and choose Encrypt, and I could encrypt the documents. I don't need any special technology to do that. I just use the storage platform. Some storage platforms will let you use single instancing, where if two users upload the same document to two different places, the storage platform will store only one copy. Or if there's two documents that are close to each other, it will do bitwise differential storage as opposed to storing two slightly different versions. So whatever the features are of your storage platform, you suddenly get to use those in SharePoint for free just because you're now storing the blob store on that other storage platform. Pretty cool. Other questions? Yeah. Do I know any what? Any web form? Yeah, to select what goes into the blob store, that's the configuration of the provider. So for example, with the file stream provider, you use PowerShell and all you can set is the file size. But with third parties, there's all kinds of options they give you for deciding what goes in. And it can be a content type, a metadata column. So I could have a little checkbox in my list that I check that says what goes into the blob store, as long as I have a third-party provider that can use that as a rule. Does that make sense? Does that answer your question? Okay. Other questions? Yes, in the back? Yeah, good question. So the question is with remote blob store, you can do things like single instancing and differential storage. Is there something in the roadmap for SharePoint doing that on its own? And I don't know, because I don't work for Microsoft. That's why I get to tell you, how to work around some of the limitations. But the flip side of that is I don't know the roadmap for that. I apologize. And actually, right now, the roadmap for SharePoint version 15, what I do know about it, I would be shot if I told you. So it's still way too early in the process to be talking about that, unfortunately. So I'm sorry. I can't answer that. Other questions? Yes. On what level do you set the rules? Again, that depends on the provider. On the file stream provider, it is that. Let me think about that. Is it done by content database or by the provider? I'm pretty sure it's done by the content database on the file stream provider. But I'm only going to say that with about 70% certainty. I personally don't use the file stream provider very often because I use the docav extender, which is free, and that has so much more flexibility as far as rules. So I'm pretty sure the file stream provider rule is set on a per content database level because the content database has the association with the provider and has properties around that association that you set with PowerShell. Other questions? All right, excellent questions. Let's jump back to our slides. Okay, the next topic I'd like to talk about in this demystifying section is talking about claims-based authentication, which is, again, something I hear a lot of confusion about, I hear a lot of misguidance about, and I'd like to give you my opinion and the thoughts I have about claims-based authentication. So let's first take a look at what happens when you create a web application and the choices you get. So we're going to go back to central administration. When we create a web application, we get to pick whether that web application is claims-based or classic mode authentication. Now, this is for the entire web application. Then, when we'll start with classic. Then we get to pick what provider to use, which in the case of Windows can be NTLM or Negotiate, or after you create the web application, you can also configure digest and basic authentication. And basic authentication allows the client to send the username and password in clear text, and you would use SSL to encrypt it. So you've got basically 4 types of authentication with Windows, the most popular, of course, NTLM and Kerberos. Now, the other option for authentication is what's called claims-based authentication, and claims-based authentication also lets you use Windows authentication. It lets you choose NTLM or Kerberos or Negotiate, and you can also check basic authentication right here, and after you create the web application, you can choose digest. So you've got Windows authentication in both classic and claims, but notice with claims, you get 2 additional choices, forms-based authentication and trusted identity provider. So you get 2 additional options. Now we're going to talk about what these things are and why you would use one or the other. So let's dive in and look. And to do this, I'm going to subject you to some of my bad art here. So we've got a web application in SharePoint. This is our web application running on an IIS server in our SharePoint farm. We have a user who wants to access that web application. Now, with Windows authentication, this should be very familiar to all of you, so this isn't new. Let's assume we're using NTLM authentication. And so we have Active Directory up here, and Active Directory has the username and password for that user. When the user goes to touch the web application, says, I want the intranet, IIS responds and says, I need authentication. And what IIS does is it challenges the user by sending a 16-bit number to the user's machine, and the user's machine then uses that number in a hash algorithm to create what's called a hash of the password, and that hash of the password is sent back to the server as a response. So the password is never sent over the network at all. It's just a hash using challenge and response. Now the server needs to then contact Active Directory to see if that password was correct. So the server calls up Active Directory and sends to Active Directory the same challenge that it sent the user and the response that the user provided. And Active Directory can take the user's real password, run it through the same algorithm to create the hash, and if the hash is successful, Active Directory tells the server, yes, that user is who they say they are, and the server builds a token for the user, and the token includes the user account and all of the groups that the user is a member of. Now IIS knows who that user is, and that token is maintained as long as the connection is open. So that's NTLM authentication, and it should be something we're all familiar with already. Kerberos authentication is slightly different. Let me change pen color here. When we use Kerberos authentication, the user goes to the web application. The web application says, no, you're not authenticated. Please bring a ticket for this web application. So that response goes back to the user saying, give me some authentication. The user goes to Active Directory, the client does, and says, I need a ticket for this web application. And Active Directory creates a ticket that it gives back to the user. So this is the ticket. And the user sends the ticket to the web application. And the ticket includes the user account and the groups that the user is a member of. Now, Kerberos is preferable for several reasons. It's a better authentication protocol for several reasons. First of which, it's standards-based as opposed to NTLM, which is proprietary. Secondly, it puts less drain, less performance hit on the server and the domain controller. There's less transactions happening, and all the server has to do is look at that ticket, and that's it. It doesn't have to go to the domain controller and do that back and forth. So it's better performing. In addition, it's more secure for a couple of reasons. It's less possible to hack it. And finally, there's the option where the web application can forward the ticket to a back-end data source. So if we're using Excel services and we're tapping into a back-end database, for example, we can forward that ticket to the back-end database server, and that can authenticate the user so that we only get back the data that user should have. So Kerberos has a lot of advantages to it. Now, the way Kerberos is working, if you think about it, is there is an identity for the user. There is a ticket that is being authorized, that is being issued, and that ticket is encrypted so that when it gets to the server knows it came from a trusted source. So there's also a trust. There's a trust between the server and the domain controller, and the trust is based on the password of that server, so the server's password. And Active Directory encrypts the ticket with the server's password. So that ticket is encrypted with the server's password, which means Active Directory hands it to the user. The user cannot decrypt it because the user doesn't have the server's password. When the ticket gets to the server can unencrypt that ticket because it has its own password. And because it successfully unencrypts it, it knows it came from the trusted source. So there's this idea of trust and certificates, and that's how Kerberos ends up working. Now, again, this should be fairly familiar to everyone because it's not unique to SharePoint. It's just Kerberos. But are there any questions about this at this point before we talk about claims? Okay. So let's talk about claims authentication. With claims authentication, we are able to use Windows authentication, so we can use NTLM, we can use Kerberos, but we also can use forms-based authentication and what's called SAML token authentication. So the way forms-based authentication works is instead of there being, let's just draw it here. So with claims-based authentication, I'm going to introduce one more player in this game. And this player is called the Security Token Service, or STS. The Security Token Service is responsible for authenticating users within a SharePoint 2010 farm. And in fact, the STS does all of the stuff I was just showing you, even with Windows authentication. So it's still the one doing the job of requesting the ticket, decrypting the ticket, and all of that. The STS can be configured to use Active Directory, as we've been talking about. But the STS can also be configured to use forms-based authentication, or FBA. And forms-based authentication can use a SQL database of users. So we can have a list of users in SQL. Forms-based authentication can also use LDAP. So we might have Active Directory Lightweight Directory Services, or Novell, as our user base, or we can use a custom .NET membership provider. When a web application is configured to use FBA, you tell the web application which provider it's using. So let's say we're using our SQL membership provider. And then there's a separate provider for group membership, so we'll call it the SQL roles provider. And by filling this in, this tells the STS that for this particular web application, we should be using this particular provider. Now, the actual configuration of forms-based authentication is a whole separate topic. It's unfortunately very painful in SharePoint, so we're not going to talk about the actual configuration right now. But within the context of claims-based authentication, we can now use that SQL database of users. And when a user touches the web application says, I need you to be authenticated. And the user is redirected to the STS. The STS presents the form that you get that has the username and password boxes. The user fills in that information, and then the STS issues the token. So once again, we have a token. We'll call it T for token. And that token is sent back to the user in the form of an encrypted cookie. The user goes and presents it back to the web application. The web application can decrypt that cookie and knows it came from the STS. So from a functional perspective, claims-based authentication so far is identical to Kerberos. It's just a different set of players, and it's a different set of standards that it's based on. But conceptually, it's the same. The user is redirected to somewhere to authenticate. That authentication provider, called the identity provider, provides a token to the user. The user brings it back to the web application as an authenticated cookie. And similarly, we can connect, as I mentioned, to LDAP or .NET providers. Now, the third type of provider that the STS can use is called a SAML token provider. And a SAML token is a standards-based security token that can be issued by any number of sources, including Windows Live ID, Facebook, Google, or other authentication that you built. And so SAML tokens are used as a web-based authentication mechanism, and I bet that every single person in this room has done some kind of SAML token authentication, even if you don't know that you've used it. So let's take a quick look at it as an example. When I go to MSDN, and I want to download some software, I only get a list of software that Microsoft makes publicly available. If I want to get to everything, I click this link, and it tells me it can't because I have to sign in. So I'm still on MSDN site, and I am unauthenticated at this point. Now, in order to get to the authenticated resources, I have to sign in. And when I click sign in, notice I'm sent to live. I'm sent to, let me see if I can zoom in on this. Well, we can see it up there, login.live.com. This is Windows Live. It's not MSDN. It's a completely different web application, and I can sign in. And Windows Live authenticates me and creates what's called a SAML token. And in that token, there is my user account and potentially any groups that I'm in. And that token is given to me as an encrypted cookie. And I am immediately bounced back to MSDN. MSDN decrypts that cookie with a key that it shares privately with Windows Live. So when a web application subscribes to an identity provider, they exchange certificates so that the encryption can happen, and we know that the cookie that the token came from the right provider. So now I'm authenticated, and that is an example of SAML token authentication. So similarly, Facebook, OpenID, there are several other standards that use SAML token authentication. Let's see, where'd my dialog box go? No, I already closed it. So the claims-based authentication, and this is the main first point, is conceptually the same as Kerberos. There's just a different set of options you have, including forms-based authentication and SAML token authentication. Now, the next point about claims-based authentication is that a lot of people are out in the community right now saying that claims-based authentication is the best thing since sliced bread. It is awesome, it's perfect, and you should use claims-based authentication because it's new in SharePoint 2010, and it should be the default. Now, I'm going to give you a different opinion, and my advice to you is going to be to use classic mode unless you really know you need claims. So that will be my advice, and we'll talk about that in just a moment. But let me first tell you why people think claims is so cool. Because there are some things that are very, very interesting about claims. The first of which is it supports what's called identity federation. Identity federation is where you can have more than one source of identities that are authenticated against. And a good example of identity federation is Active Directory Federated Services, which is part of Active Directory in Windows Server 2008. And ADFS is a service that users can authenticate against. And ADFS is configured to point to trust certain identity sources like your domain. So a user goes to ADFS, and ADFS authenticates the user against your domain. But ADFS can also authenticate a user against a partner's domain. So your partners can now authenticate to SharePoint through ADFS, and you don't need a Windows trust to do this. It's all done with standards-based web services. Similarly, you can configure ADFS to authenticate third parties against Windows Live. So ADFS is like an Uber authentication tool that allows users to authenticate in one place, even if those user accounts might be in one of several different sources. And that is pretty cool. Supporting federated identity is very, very interesting, and in the future, it will become more and more important. My personal guess, and this is just a purely personal opinion, is that in Windows 9, Active Directory will look much more like ADFS than it does look like Active Directory today. The whole industry is moving towards claims authentication. It's standards-based, it's extensible, there's all kinds of good reasons why claims are the future. But today, unless you need ADFS, maybe not. The other thing that's so cool about claims is in traditional authentication, when the user was authenticated and the web application built the token representing the user, the server built the token, it had the username and groups that the user belonged to. And that's important information, but what if the web application needs to know what country the user is a citizen of, or what their email address is, or how old the user is? In the past, a developer would have to create a database in the web application of your citizenship, or your age, or your email address. And it would have to maintain that database, even though that information might be stored somewhere else already. And then they'd have to synchronize those databases. Or the web application would have to go look up the information all the time, which put a burden on the web application. So that was problematic for developers. With claims-based authentication, the token that has your username in it, and maybe your groups, can also have all kinds of other information. So when I authenticate against Active Directory Federated Services, ADFS can put in my username and groups, but it can also go look up my citizenship from a trusted database. It can look up my age from a trusted database. It can pull in my email address. And ADFS can put all of that into a single token so that when I come to the web application for the first time, the web application knows a lot about me. It knows not just my username and groups, but it knows all that other information. And then the code can use that information without having to maintain it. So I, as an IT pro, can now create a permission for a list that says you must be a citizen of Belgium to access this list. Or a part of my website, you must be over 18 years old. And I can do that based on trusted information that the user is bringing with them just as they bring their authentication. So that is one of the things that's very, very, very cool about claims. And in the future, that's going to become more and more and more important. So my guidance to you is today, if you require forms-based authentication, if you require SAML token authentication, or if you have code that uses claims, then yes, you have to use claims. But otherwise, stick with Classic. Use Classic unless you really have a reason to use claims. You can convert from Classic to claims one time. You cannot go back. So before you convert, go into a lab and make sure everything's going to work. Because one of the problems with claims is because it is new, some things break. There's third-party tools that break when you use claims. There's even some parts of Microsoft's code that breaks when you use claims. Power Pivot Refresh doesn't work with claims, only works with Classic. So you need to be very careful to only go to this brand new stack of code when you really know you need it, when you've tested it. And that's my opinion on claims-based authentication. So any questions on claims-based authentication? Yes? The actual version of SAML, I actually don't remember. I did know that, but I don't remember it off the top of my head. Does anyone else know that off the top of their head? Is it SAML 1.0 or 2.0? Yeah. I think that's true. I think 1.1 is the standard, but I don't remember off the top of my head, so I apologize. Other questions? Yeah.
The form-based authentication, the page itself, is that provided by the SharePoint or through the third party like gateway? Those serving pages for you?
Yes, so if you use, his question is about forms-based authentication and what provides the actual form. The STS, the Security Token Service, has a default form in it that just basically says username and password. And you can customize that within SharePoint. So it's part of SharePoint, and you can further customize that. Oh, and by the way, let me just show you this so if you see it later, you know what you're seeing. If we go back into our SharePoint server and look at our service applications, let's see, application management, service applications. You will always see the security token service. That is installed by default when you install SharePoint Foundation or SharePoint Server. It's always there. You can't get rid of it, and you can't add another one. This is the authentication provider in SharePoint. All your web applications, whenever they require authentication, they redirect the user to the STS. The STS does the job of authenticating the user against Windows, or if you're using claims, it can also use Forms or SAML. The STS creates the token, gives it to the user, and the user brings it back to the web app. So the STS is a very, very, very important service application. Behind the scenes, it's running in an application pool all of its own. So if we look here, there's the Security Token Service application pool. It's running as SP Farm, so it's running as the most privileged account in the farm, and that's what's going on there. The last thing I'd like to do, and I know we're running close to the end of our time, so I'm going to do this quickly, is I'd like to give you an understanding of service applications. If you're new to SharePoint, the model and the terminology is really strange, so I'm going to run through this as quickly as I can here, and then if you've got additional questions, feel free to come up during lunch. I'll be happy to answer them, but I want to cover this. Service applications are how SharePoint provides services to one or more web applications in your farm. So the model is that you have a consumer. Let's just say it's an Excel web part that is rendering Excel worksheets. And you might have that happening in several web applications. And instead of putting the code to render Excel worksheets in every single web application, SharePoint has a service running on the back end that performs Excel calculations. And a web application just simply taps into that service, the service provides the data, and the web application renders it. So the question from a design perspective is how to architect this, and this is a question Microsoft had to answer. And in SharePoint 2007, there was a model called the SSPs, Shared Service Providers. And the SSP was a single collection of multiple services, Excel, search, InfoPath forms, profiles, and a web application connected to the SSP and consumed all of its services. But that had a lot of problems from a topology perspective. And so with SharePoint 2010, Microsoft changed the model and created service applications where a service is represented by a single service application. So Excel has a service application, Search has a separate service application, so there's a granular relationship. And a web application connects to the service to get the services it needs, and a web application can pick the services it needs, so two different web applications can connect to several different sets of services. So it's much more granular, much more flexible, much more scalable. So this is the granularity part. From a scalability part, services can be published across farms. At least some of the more important services can, like search and metadata. And so you can actually have search in your central data center running on a farm, and you could have a remote farm that when a user performs search, it's actually using the central farm's search service. So core services can be published across farms, which is great. And they are scalable. If you want to add more performance to Excel services, you simply add the service to additional servers. So the service itself can run on one or more servers. And the service application, there's still one of them. So Excel services with a service running on one server might start slowing down. And so you simply add Excel services to a second server. And the service application distributes the request to the services in a round-robin fashion so that they scale out. Is everyone okay so far? Okay. In addition, there's an interesting fact that you can have several service applications for the same service. So for example, let's assume the service is search. We could actually have two different service applications that have different sets of indexes. So one might be our entire enterprise, and one might be just a subset of resources that we share with partners. So our partner extranet would use that search service application and would have no way of accessing the information that's provided by the enterprise search service. So you can scale services out, and you can also scale service applications, which then basically give you different flavors of the same service, different sets of configuration. So service applications are very, I'm not sure what I just did there, are an interesting model, and the key thing to think about is the terminology. The service does the work. The service is the actual process that renders an Excel worksheet, that indexes your content, that performs queries in your environment. And the services are managed in central administration using the Managed Services on Server link. So if we're in central administration, we manage services on server. These are the actual services that are doing the work, and for each server in our farm, we can start and stop the services. The service has to run on at least one server, but it can run on more than one server. So the service does the work. The service application represents that service and does a couple of things. First of all, it will distribute requests between multiple instances of the server, and it will manage the configuration of the service. So it will manage, for example, what gets indexed or which worksheets are allowed to be rendered. So the service application provides management, it provides distribution of requests, and then the consumer, the web application, connects to the service. And the consumer can connect to the service using what's called an application connection or proxy. So the consumer doesn't connect directly to the service application, it connects through what's called a proxy. So when we look again at central administration and look at our service applications, you'll see that a service application like Excel services has a web service and a proxy. The proxy is the connection that allows the communication from a consumer. And each service application has a proxy, so each one has its own, and the consumer can then connect to the services it needs. Now, chances are you're going to have lots of services and lots of web applications, and it will get pretty old to connect each web application to individual services. So there's also a component called the, whoops, what did I missed a piece of my slides here. There is a connection group, and the connection group simply bundles the connections into a single group. The web application can connect one time, and through the group can connect to all of the services it needs. So a web application can either connect directly to the proxies or to a group of proxies. Now, this model may seem a little bit complicated, and the reason it's complicated is simply that each of these pieces play a specific role. The service does the work. The service application manages the service. The proxy controls communication to the service. The connection is what the web application connects to the service with, and it can connect to a group. And because each of these things have their own roles, this is what provides the scalability. Let me show you this here, where if you are connecting to a service in another farm, the service and the service application is in the remote farm. The connection is in the local farm. So in your farm, you connect to a service in another farm. So that's the model. And to summarize, one of the really key points here is the terminology is an absolute disaster. Let me pull up that slide here. You will hear services called services, service instances, which are technically a little bit different, and other things. You'll hear a service application called a service. You'll hear a connection called a proxy, and a proxy group called a connection group. You'll hear the web application association called the service connection. So the terminology is just crazy. So it's important that you are able to maintain a visual picture of how this works, so that regardless of the terms that are used, you can think about the pieces that are in play. And even in Microsoft's own interface, you can see we've got here the Excel proxy, and here the metadata service connection. Those are both the connections that allow communication to the service. The Excel service is called a service application. Managed metadata is called a service. It's really a service application. So the terminology is bizarre. The model is new. Between those two, it can create a lot of confusion. And if you've got questions about this, definitely, when you download the slides, meditate on this picture right here. Sit in front of it for an hour or two until you totally understand what each of these pieces do, and that will help you a lot. So with that then, let me jump to the last couple of slides here. At the end of the deck, there are, again, my email address. Of course, there are resources that you've been introduced to throughout this event for Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn. And all of these slides will be available for you on the website later on today, right? Right, Dieter? Is it going to be all ready at the end of the day? Hopefully. We don't know quite yet. But it'll be there soon. And if you would like the slides sooner, you can email me or get them from my SkyDrive. So thank you guys very much for coming. Hopefully I'll see those of you in the SharePoint space this afternoon for our Managing the SharePoint Disruption session. After lunch, I have an Active Directory session on managing user data and settings across physical and virtual environments. If you've got any questions, please do feel free to come up, but I've run a little bit long, so I'd like to let you get to lunch. Thank you guys very much.